I was able to maintain that level of extreme intoxication for years and years and years. And they pulled out a tiny snub-nosed revolver out of the glove compartment, and the driver turned and he just put it lazily over his shoulder, right in my face. And he said, "There is fine, $1,000 this experience. I experience it as awe, but it's the same sensation." And I found it on the peak of Huashan Mountain, and I found it in connection with everyday strangers who just wanted to help. I was drinking at that level. There were long periods when I was cycling where the water bottle on my bike frame was actually filled with vodka instead of water. And I'd quite often be drunk by 11 a.m., cycle, collapse. And when you put a person with that personality, give them a brain injury, and then drop them in Shanghai, of all places, it's kind of a recipe for disaster, which it was for me in the end.
Were you lonely?
I thought that that was a good opportunity to cycle from Shanghai back to London, and on the way, take out this problem, whatever it was that was growing inside me, take it out into the Gobi Desert and just strangle it there.
I discovered backcountry a few months ago, and it has been one of the most fascinating and really rewarding storytelling journeys I've been on recently on this platform. So thank you so much for your output. Thank you so much for your content. And thank you so much for joining me.
Well, that's very high praise. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
So let's get into it. What is your definition of alcoholism? What is problem drinking to you? Can you describe it for me?
Yeah, I think in the process of talking about this subject so often, I have defined a point at which I think you can safely define yourself as a problem drinker. And that point is the point at which you start drinking to medicate problems caused by drinking. Okay, so I think a lot of people who have had a problem with alcohol will point to when they started taking a hair of the dog as the moment that began for them. And I kind of agree. I think that is a threshold after which it's very difficult to return back to moderate drinking.
So, hair of the dog. So, what you're saying is when somebody gets up in the morning, they've had a hard night, they've been drunk, they've gone too far. In the morning time, they reach for the bottle and they disrupt. Perhaps they have to go to work, perhaps they have to go to the job. Once they start disrupting in the morning what they were supposed to be doing, then we're into problem drinking territory, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there are some people, I'm sure, who can take a hair of the dog or perhaps go with a group of friends back to the pub on a Sunday morning. And I think that's slightly different. Some people can do that relatively healthy forever. But people who have a predisposition towards alcohol, people like me, we will be doing that on a Monday morning instead of a Sunday. And what we'll do is we'll drink ourselves to blackout on a Sunday, wake up the Monday morning, have a swig, and then go to work. But then, of course, your whole day is ruined. Your whole day is defined by that shot that you took for breakfast, essentially. And once that becomes a pattern of behavior, then you've crossed the line from being able to control it to it controlling you.
What's your perspective on the genetic? Have you looked into the genetic piece here with alcoholism?
Yeah, yeah. There is a massive genetic component. I think it's from personal experience. There is addiction in my family. There's it manifests in various forms, but there was a gambling addiction in my bloodline, as well as alcoholism, and that's common. It's really common to all of us to have the chances of you being an alcoholic, however you define that, in later life, is much higher if somebody in your immediate family also was an alcoholic. The science and the experience, they kind of come together on this. It seems unanimous.
Okay. Your descent and your journey, and you track it and you talk about it in a very compelling and powerful way on Bat Country. But give us the overall idea of what that descent looked like. So you're a normal young man, you're in, when did you start drinking and when did you realize, okay, it's problematic and it's gone to episodic, to binge drinking, to very serious? Describe that.
Okay, so my first kind of drink by choice, my first consenting time getting drunk, I was 14. I grew up in an Irish family, but I grew up in a rural part of South England, a place in Hampshire, outside Winchester. And it was a farming community, and access to alcohol was extremely common, really, really easy, and unregulated. So we could go to our local Circle K back then and be 14 years old, barely growing a moustache, but still quite happily walk out with a bottle of Frosty Jacks and then drink it in an alleyway somewhere. And it was a problem straight away for me, immediately. And it was obvious that it was, I think. My surname is Nugent, and my nickname growing up naturally was Nugget, same as my dad's and my granddad's they were also Nuggets. And while we were growing, my peers and I were growing up, 14 years old, starting to investigate drinking. From the first drink, I had a compulsion to put as much of it in my body as possible. And there used to be a level, a threshold of drunkenness even when we were 14, called nugged, which was to get nugged, which is to achieve this kind of blackout but still functioning space of drunkenness. And that was called being nugged. And I think a lot of people, society puts pressure, especially on guys, to be very macho in their drinking. And I think a lot of people would be proud of having their nickname associated with a certain level of drunkenness. I hated it straight away. And looking back as an adult now sober, I can see that 14-year-old me with exactly the same drinking patterns as I would continue to have into my 30s. It was just my metabolism that changed, I think. That was all. And I got a bit taller. And aside from that, it was all the same. But I was able to maintain that level of extreme intoxication for years and years and years, and still have a career and hold down relationships, never got fired, was rarely late, my work ethic was always good. And then one day, my job located me in Shanghai, and I'd been there for about 4 years. And I had a bicycle accident. I was very fit, very active, even through years of drinking. And I went over the front of a taxi, and I woke up in the hospital. And I wouldn't find out until very many months, years later, that I had suffered a traumatic brain injury in my frontal lobe. And that had accelerated the entire process. From that day, I was always a candidate for alcoholism. It could have happened anyway, right? But from that day, my drinking got wildly out of hand. My relationships began to break down. My on-the-job performance was poor. I became very impulsive and very reckless and very dangerous to be around. I was always intense. And when you put a person with that personality, give them a brain injury and then drop them in Shanghai of all places, it's kind of a recipe for disaster, which it was for me in the end.
Were you lonely?
Yes. And for a long time, I convinced myself that loneliness, I taught myself to be okay with it. I used to tell people I'm very happy in my own company. That was a euphemism I used for loneliness. And I think a lot of people hide behind that phrase because I hear it a lot, especially from other alcoholics, that we're happy in our own company. And what that really means is that you're isolated, I think.
Do you think it's bravado
yourself,
as well?
It's bravado. It's wanting a desire to be seen as a kind of lone wolf.
Yeah.
and capable and independent, but in truth, it's quite often loneliness. It's a very difficult thing for people, for straight guys to say to each other, "I'm lonely," So the antidote to that tends to be that you hang around with a group of people that you don't really know, and you are hanging around to justify each other's drinking, to stave off that feeling of loneliness and to kid yourself that you have a vibrant social life and that kind of thing, when really you're lonely.
You're in China. Um, what happens then? So you're holding down a job. Everything is going fine. You're drinking. Are we talking 5 days a week, 2 days a week, 7 days a week at this stage?
It was essentially every day, every moment of every day, there was alcohol involved in one way. Either I was hungover, or I was drinking, or I was drunk. There's not really much middle ground.
Right.
The crazy thing is, because I've been quite fit throughout my 20s, a lot of martial arts and endurance athletics, like long distance running and that kind of thing. I was able to maintain that even while it would have lain somebody less fit down. So I would quite often finish work. I worked in this really nice office in central Shanghai, and I would be drinking. I'd walk home. It was a 45-minute walk home, and I really relished that time. Very gorgeous. It was humid, and the weather was usually good, and you could hear the cicadas bristling in the trees. It was very evocative and made me feel very connected to the city. But I would walk out of the office and buy a small bottle of whiskey, and I would be drunk by the time I got home. Spend time with a girlfriend or whoever I was with at that time, and then drink after that person had gone to bed, or I would go out and have a big night. But then I'd be up again at 6 a.m. and in the gym at 7 and at work at 9. So for a while, there's a horrible phrase in alcohol apologism, I suppose, which is functioning alcoholic. And I think I would fall into that category for several years, especially in China.
Were people mentioning it to you at this stage? I mean, your girlfriend must have been saying, "Okay, what's going on with this? I can smell it on your breath." And your employers must have mentioned something, surely.
Uh, no. So my friend group was a friend group of convenience, as often happens, especially if you're away from home. The friends you have are not, they're friends to make you feel like you've got friends rather than deep connected friends.
Mm.
And we depended on each other to stave off the loneliness. That's what we were doing. And none of them would ever criticize somebody else's drinking, because of course that would make you you would have to look in the mirror to do that. If your drinking is bad, then mine must be. So no one ever said it. Although it was a problem for all of us, I think, or most of us. And my job, I was relatively senior in the job, in the company that I was working for. And my reputation was good. And it was a creative role. I was a brand manager, but it was like a creative manager, which meant that it was okay to be spiky and unapproachable. You know, it's so gross that creative directors have a lot of leeway, because when you're hungover and in a bad mood, people just think it's part of the process. And I was able to do that. You know, I'd walk around in the afternoon and be resting my head against a window pane, and people wouldn't approach me because they're just being, oh, he's creating. No, I'm hungover. And I think we don't do a good enough job of calling out that kind of behaviour, because it can be helpful to have that called out sometimes. But long story short, no one really called it out for me. The relationship I had in China broke down before the alcohol became a major problem. So I didn't have a girlfriend telling me she can smell it on my breath. Instead, I relied on, short-term and casual relationships where there was less judgment and less commitment. And that enabled me to hide my growing problem for longer, I think. We do that. We push people away before things get real,
And what age would you have been then in the Shanghai years, the China years?
I moved there when I was 27,
Mm.
28, and I finally left when I was 34.
Yeah, this is a familiar story here, because there's an upward curve, and it starts to get problematic, particularly problematic in the late 20s and early 30s. It just seems to be a pattern that's repeating itself. Um, you're not the first person I've talked to about this, and then it comes to a crescendo. So you're in China, you're really developing a serious problematic drinking situation. You then decide to take a bicycle, and what happened next? What preempted this cycle across Asia?
Okay, several things, right? So when I arrived in China, when I relocated from London, I went by train the entire way from London to Shanghai.
Mm.
And it was 11 days on the train across the Trans-Mongolian. And I remember looking out of the window on that train journey, and we were rolling across the Gobi Desert, somewhere outside Ulaanbaatar, somewhere incredibly remote, like I'd never ever seen before. And I remember looking at the expanse of that place and feeling incredibly small. And something about that resonated in me. The bleakness of it found a home in me. And I loved it. And I told myself, even then, that if I ever had to leave China, I wanted to do it under my own power. But it was just a dream, like just an idea back then. And I never thought it would come real. But eventually, the drinking and the reckless lifestyle in Shanghai began to really get on top of me. I began to feel sick. And these creeping addictions, they tend to hide themselves very, very well from you. You don't recognize there's a problem until it's too late. And for me, I recognized that it was a problem. And what I wanted to do, given the opportunity to move my job from Shanghai back to Europe, I thought that was a good opportunity to cycle from Shanghai back to London, and on the way take out this problem, whatever it was that was growing inside me, take it out into the Gobi Desert and just strangle it there and just leave it behind, and then emerge from the desert a new man, better and fixed. And that was the goal. But even saying it back now sounds ridiculous.
It's almost Christ-like, and I'm an atheist, but this is an almost Christ-like into the desert. There is a metaphysical, almost allegorical way you're looking at this. I don't find it unusual at all what you're trying to do. You're trying to purge this demon, and the biblical way of doing it was Christ walks into the desert and comes and faces death, and his emergence back into society is because of what he experienced out there in total isolation. So there's nothing unusual about it.
Well, thank you. That's reassuring. And you're absolutely right. That is exactly the perfect phrase. I was trying to purge it. I was trying to starve it out. Because I understood it so poorly that I didn't think, like, surely therapy would have been better, right? Instead of a 13,000 kilometer bike ride through the desert and through the mountains. But it made perfect sense to me at the time. And for a while, in fact, it worked. It worked. So I set off with very little planning. Like, the goal of it was to struggle, which meant that I didn't want to be too prepared. And I wanted to have to improvise, and I wanted it to be difficult. That was the point. If I wanted it to be easy, I would have just flown. The point was the arduousness.
You've got to suffer. Got
to suffer. I felt like I deserved it, or I needed to.
It's the hero's journey. I mean, it's countless films have been written about this, but you're so you're thinking about this, but you embark and you do it. So you're on the bicycle. You get the bicycle.
Yeah. So I got the bicycle. I didn't test it before I set off. I just got on it and went. And for about 2.5 months across China, it worked. I did stay completely sober, and I'm also not a spiritual person, but I found a lot in common with people who have spiritual experiences on journeys like this. I call it awe. A lot of people will call it spirituality or a religious experience. I experience it as awe, but it's the same sensation. And I found it on the peak of Huashan Mountain, and I found it in connection with everyday strangers who just wanted to help, and in beautiful landscapes and difficult situations. I experienced all of that as awe, and it was, for a while, truly, profoundly, I don't know what the word is.
Transcendental.
Yeah. Transcendental. And I understood for a while. But what happened was that couldn't last for me, unfortunately. I thought I was okay. I really had strangled it in the desert. But I tried to go into Tajikistan and was not able. There was some kind of military operation across the border. And I had to come back into China and then go into Kyrgyzstan. And very early there, I kind of had a big step back. So I'll tell you very briefly, specifically what happened. I had a bike malfunction. As I was coming over the mountain, I had suffered a problem with my bike. And I had to hitchhike into a local town. And to keep my bike safe, what I did was I found a tiny island in the middle of this incredibly fast-flowing river. And because I knew I was going to have to be away for a few days to find a town, I would have to stow the bike somewhere safe. So I waded all of my stuff across onto this island, across the river, and then waded back and I set off into this town. And when I returned a couple of days later with all the tools, I waded, the river had swelled. It had become very, very fast. And as I was crossing the river to retrieve my stuff, I had a snake emerged in the water right in front of me. And it bent up out of the water and it flipped back down and it flicked me with its tail as if a warning. And I had no prior fear of snakes before that, but I'd never been confronted by one in a fast-flowing Kyrgyz river before either. So I dropped all of my stuff, and in my panic to reach it again, I nearly drowned. I was nearly dragged into a reservoir. Very, very lucky to survive. And I was underwater for a long time. And I dragged myself to the side of the river, and I pulled out a bottle of vodka from my bag that I bought to share and to make friends with. And I drank the entire thing. And from there, I was never, ever without alcohol again for months and months and months. I was drinking at that level. There were long periods when I was cycling where the water bottle on my bike frame was actually filled with vodka instead of water. And I'd quite often be drunk by 11 a.m., cycle, collapse. I can't tell you how dangerous that is. Those roads alone, sober, are incredibly dangerous, through the mountains, through the Taldir Pass and all of that kind of thing. At like 4,000 meters, they are very, very dangerous at the best of times. But when you're absolutely blasted and making very poor decisions, it's twice as dangerous. And I don't take it for granted how lucky I am to be alive right now.
Did you have any near misses with articulated trucks or cars or?
Yeah, daily. In places like that, in Kyrgyzstan in particular, you don't get a driver's license. You don't take a test. You go to the local police station, you give them $15 and they hand you a permit to drive your car. So there are very powerful cars being driven. There are just no laws. There are no laws. And the roadways that wind up between the peaks have barriers on the edge. And quite often, as you swing round a bend, you can look over the side and it's just a canyon straight down for like hundreds of feet on the other side. And the bottom of the ravine is just wreckage of cars. So, yeah, incredibly dangerous. I had several close calls. I had one where a small, like, flatbed van overtook me and spilled watermelons. It's a load of watermelons into the road, and I hit one of the watermelons and it slipped off my bike. So sometimes they were quite benign, but usually it was quite scary.
So you make it. You arrive. You're halfway through Asia. You're still alive. You're subsisting on alcohol and very little food, and you make it to one particular place, and then there's an incident where you get arrested. What happened then?
Yeah. So two things happened, right? After I got through Kyrgyzstan, my actual time, despite the alcohol, my time in Kyrgyzstan was quite pleasant. But the people of Kyrgyzstan were so good to me, so friendly and accommodating and fun, that I assumed that would just continue as I crossed the border into Kazakhstan. But it was not the case. There's only an invisible border between the two nations, but they are incredibly different. And I arrived in a town called Almaty, and my bike was stolen that first day that I arrived, the first city that I'd been in for weeks. I arrived as I was rolling in to find a hotel. I stopped to check my map, and these four kind of old, like middle-aged men approached, and one of them gestured to my bike as if, like, can I ride your bike? And because I was still high on the friendliness of Kyrgyzstan, I was like, yeah, please do it, because it's a good way to make friends. And the guy got on it and rode it and just kept riding until he was gone. And there was a long, uncomfortable pause as his three friends were in front of me. And it was made very obvious to me that he wasn't coming back, and there was nothing I could do about it. And that was my initiation into Kazakhstan. And I spent about 3 weeks in that town trying to locate the bike and continue my journey. But really, I was a mess by then. It was really bad already. So I made my way to another city on the Caspian Sea called Aktau. And Aktau was where everything truly went wrong. So
It's like Star Wars here. It's like it's like one of those communities in where all of the lunatics show up and they're. But yeah, Aktau it's called, right.
yeah, Aktau's a scary place. It's called the Riviera, the Caspian Riviera, but that's a very lofty name. It is no such thing. What it actually is an old Soviet secret nuclear city. So in the 60s, a nuclear refinement plant was built right there on the coast of the Caspian. And it just ejected the nuclear waste into the salt flats, which have since dried up and glow a very lurid green in the evening. It's a very strange place. It's completely radioactive. And because the people who live there, none of them really chose to be there. They're all like the descendants and the families of like Soviet prisoners and ex-soldiers who were sent there to work and have grown up there since. And as such, it is a very rough and violent place. My memory of arriving was just smoke on the horizon. And as I approached, it was abject poverty. Like there were children playing naked next to a puddle, and then a stray dog with a broken leg limping across the road. And all of the men walked around with these very poor quality tattoos, not that I can talk, but covered in scars and tattoos, and their shirts off. And where my size and my general appearance had provided some protection, I'm quite a big guy, it provided some protection in places like China and Kyrgyzstan. There in Aktau, it made me a target. Like those guys wanted to challenge me. They wanted to test how tough they were against me. And it was very violent. And I was hiding in a hostel. I'd found a hostel where the manager had allowed me to stay for free, providing I'd be his drinking buddy. And of course I obliged. So 9 o'clock every morning, he and I are drinking vodka together. And then I'd go out in the day and then come back and drink more. Until it became very obvious that to the local authorities, the police, that there was a drunk Westerner wandering around the beach, wandering around the waterfront. And I was an obvious target, and I was obviously alone, and I was obviously vulnerable, drinking very, very heavily. And one day, as I was walking along the beach, an old larder pulled up next to me, and 2 uniformed police got out. The car was unmarked, but the officers were in uniform. And they threatened to deport me unless I paid a $1,000 fine. And they drove me onto a military base. And as if to emphasize my powerlessness, they drove me onto an army base to say, like, there's nothing you can do, give us our money. And I paid. We negotiated down. I paid $500 in the end. They called it a fine, but it was a bribe. That's exactly what it was. And because I had paid, word got around the police that there was money to be made from me. And a couple of days later, I was picked up again, and the policeman threatened to deport me, just as the first group had done. And I said, good, deport me. And then instead of taking me to the army base, they drove me out into the salt flat, this radioactive wasteland, for a long time, what felt like forever, into the middle of absolutely nowhere. And then eventually stopped, and they pulled out a tiny snub-nosed revolver out of the glove compartment. And the driver turned and he just put it lazily over his shoulder, right in my face. And he said, "There is fine, $1,000. And I knew then that it would have been so easy for them to leave me there. Like, there's no negotiating at that point. That is like the rumors you hear about Nevada. Is that kind of place where there are holes in the desert. And I told them I would pay. I told them I would have to get the money sent to me. And they returned me back to the hostel. And I went in the front and I grabbed a bag and I jumped out of the back window and I ran clean across the city to the port to await a boat across the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan. And that boat took a week to arrive. And there was a shop in the port, very, very small one, like a shack. And every day I would go there and I would buy a full 700, whatever it is, bottle of vodka. And I would sit outside in the port in the baking sun and just drink and drink and drink. Until the day the boat finally arrived. I've been waiting for that boat for nearly a month now. And when it arrived, this isn't a ferry, it's a cargo ship. And the process is really hard to explain, but you go and you buy a ticket from one guy and then you go and get it authenticated by another guy, and then you go to the dock. And the final gate, the final hurdle that I had to get through to leave Kazakhstan was a police customs booth. And there I handed over the ticket and handed over the passport, and the officer looked at the passport and he said, "This visa is out of date." And I said, "No, it isn't. It can't have been. It wasn't." And he handed it back to me, and I put in $15 and handed it back. And he opened it and he looked disgusted, like he was, as if I had had the effrontery to try to bribe him, which of course I had. That's what I was trying to do, because that is what I expected to do. And he put it down, he put it on the desk to shout at me in Russian. And as he was shouting, I slid it off the desk and into my hand. And then another police officer came to intervene because things were getting very heated. I bonded with this Italian girl while we were waiting for the ship, and she was suddenly claiming at the top of her voice that she was my girlfriend. Never met her before, but I'm really impressed by her willingness to try to defend me. And it got really, really heated. And the other policeman came over and he tried to snatch the passport out of my hand. And that passport, it was all I had. I had given up on Kazakhstan. I wanted to leave, and that passport was the only thing that mattered in that moment. All my bike, everything had been stolen over a number of days. And as he tried to snatch it out of my hand, I leant back and I punched him with everything I had right on the side of the face. And he went down like a sack of potatoes. It's to this day, it's the hardest I've ever punched anybody in anger. And before I knew it, my legs had been swept, and the other police were now on top of me, giving me a serious beating. They kicked my teeth out, broke my jaw. I mean, I punched a policeman. They were queuing up after that. They all wanted to go. And then from there, I was taken to a holding jail, a holding cell, and then moved to a prison. And I spent over a week without any contact with the outside world in a Kazakh prison, in a cell with 4 other people, all of them terrifying, and suddenly having to go through alcohol withdrawal at the same time.
Yeah, the anxiety and the existential terror, coupled with the actual physical proximity to 4 people that could probably kill you with the bare hands. I mean, most people would not end up in this kind of scenario. What was your mental state like at this point?
It was awful. I was I was a real mess, and the word mess doesn't do any kind of justice to what I was like. I didn't care. Like when the police took me out into the salt flats and they pulled the gun out, instead of being terrified, I was kind of like willing to push it to see how far. Although I knew I was powerless, I was kind of curious to see where it would go because everything had been taken at that point. And there was a number of other things that had been quite traumatic right up to that moment. For example, a very horrific car crash for which I was the first person on the scene and had someone die in my hands, a young woman, to a terrible head injury. And all of this had accumulated to the point where I I can't explain what I was feeling. It wasn't fear, not observably. I think it was fear. It was just manifesting very strangely by just not caring at all, being completely void of emotion. And when I was put in that cell, I had no idea back then that alcohol withdrawal was even a thing. Like, I had no idea that I'd been drinking that volume for that long. I'd lost touch with reality. I think I'd lost touch. And there was a guy in my cell who had been stabbed before I got there, shortly before I got there, judging by the freshness of the wound, all the way across his abdomen. And he was stitching up his stab wound with his own bootlace. So just pushing the bootlace, cut with a tiny little pinprick, just cutting the hole, pulling the bootlace through and sewing it up. And then he put his hand around the toilet, the rim of the toilet, to get the disinfectant, and he cleaned the wound with that. And that was my first day in prison in Kazakhstan.
So this is a vision of a hellish, nightmarish. I mean, it's Dante's Inferno. It's the ultimate unimaginable horror. But obviously, so what happens next?
So I am sleeping by day. Okay, so it was made aware that I was screaming the first night that I was there. And that is a product both of the recent trauma that I'd suffered and also of alcohol withdrawal. I was having screaming fits at night, and it was disturbing the other prisoners. And I had no doubt that if it continued, they would kill me. Like, whether that's actually true or not, I don't know, but that's how I felt.
How you felt, yeah.
Yeah. So I would, when they were out of the cell, perhaps going to eat or walk around the yard or whatever, that's when I would sleep. And in the evening, at night, I would just stare at the flies on the ceiling, trying to keep myself awake to prevent myself from screaming so that they wouldn't murder me. And that continued for several days. Alcohol withdrawal lasts a long time. It's not like a hangover. That's a different thing. Withdrawal is brutally difficult. And I was there for 8 days with no contact with the outside world and no acknowledgement, no one checking on me. When a guard eventually came to the cell and he said, "Mr. Nugent, there is a call for you." And I was like, "A call? Great." And they brought me through all these gates and into this office, and I was handed a phone. And I put the headset to my head and I said, "Hello?" And then this British voice on the other end said, "Mr. Nugent, I believe you require consulate assistance." And it was
a relief.
Oh, such a relief. Like, usually when you hear that accent, nothing good happens, right? that real BBC accent, it's only bad news usually. But I was so relieved to hear that. How they had found me, what processes had been going on behind the scenes, I have no idea. But this voice said that it was the British Embassy in Astana, in the capital. And they had arranged for a lawyer and a translator to come and collect me. And I was like, "Oh, fantastic." And they said, "Yes, due to the nature of your crime, you're going to be put on trial." I was like, wow, I don't even really remember committing a crime. Like, I'm not really sure what happened. So when is this trial going to happen? And they said, well, it's going to happen today. Good luck. And with that, the kind of line went dead. There were some formalities, but that was the end of the conversation. And one of the prison officers drove me out for about an hour away from the prison along this dirt road to an intersection with another dirt road in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And then opened the door and went to the back of it. It must have been his personal car, I think. And then he opened the boot and he pulled out my rucksack and left it by the side of the car. And he got in his car and he just drove away. And I was like, am I free? Am I still under arrest? What's going on here? And naturally, when I'd been arrested, there was still a bottle of vodka in my bag that I was saving for the journey across the Caspian. And I had no idea what I was doing in the middle of the desert, whether I should start walking or whether I should try to formulate a plan of action. But what, of course, I actually did after a week of alcohol withdrawal in the prison was I got drunk again. I just opened the bottle of vodka and started drinking. And eventually a car appeared on the horizon doing 100 miles an hour in my direction. And somehow by intuition and by the fact there was nothing else around for 100 kilometers, I knew it was for me. And the car pulled up and the window rolled down and this beautiful Kazakh woman said, "Mr. Nugent." I said, "Well, yes, obviously." She said, "Go on, get in, we don't have much time." And it turns out that was my translator and the driver was my lawyer. And we drove back to Aktau, another hour. So wherever I'd been, it was quite far away from the city. I've never found it, but we were driven back into the city, and that day I really was put on trial. I was put on trial not just for punching a policeman. They had also accused me of trying to steal his gun. When I understand a little bit why. When I'd grabbed he'd gone to take my passport and I'd grabbed his wrist and pinned it to his hip. It's a technique we're taught in Krav Maga, actually, about gun control. And I pinned it to his hip and then I punched him over the top. And it must have looked like I was going for his gun, but I wasn't. But also, they'd really beaten me up. I was missing teeth, I had a fractured jaw. And I think they needed to increase the charge to justify their own severe handling of me. But, that's speculative. But I was put on trial by three proper robed judges with a room full of court attendants and photographers and lawyers, and all in Russian, not a single word in English. Every time I had to answer a question, I was stood on this plinth in the middle of the room with a crowd behind me, and I would be asked a question, and I would turn to my lawyer, Radik, and he would nod, and if he nodded, I would say, "Da," and if he shook his head, I would say, "Niet." And that was the extent of my understanding of being on trial, potentially for the rest of my life. The stakes were very high. And at some point, that lawyer, and we're still in touch, actually. We still, vaguely, he watches all my gym workout videos, which is very strange. But we're still friendly. And he must have been a very renowned figure in that town, because he was able to win over the court in my favor by making jokes at my expense, I think. He was joking about me, because I'd gone straight from the jail to the desert to the trial. So I was in my clothes that I'd been wearing for 3 months. My beard was all over the place. I was missing teeth and I looked wild. And he managed to soften the tone of the room such that I was released into the custody of the police that day and then immediately deported to Azerbaijan.
So what was the conviction? What was the sentence? What was the how was the verdict?
I don't know. I know that I had to apologize. I apologized in English in the courtroom. I apologized for my behavior and for offending the hospitable nature of Kazakhstan, was, I think, how I phrased it. And that was received very well. The thing is, right, I don't know what the conclusion of the trial was, but I know that the day that I was released was the first time Vladimir Putin had ever visited that city. Okay, and I don't think it's beyond the realm of impossibility that I was a diplomatic nuisance in that prison. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just a diplomatic problem. And I think the judgment that was passed in the case may have been decided before I got there, behind the scenes, but with pressure from the British embassy, like a mutual arrangement. Like Vladimir Putin doesn't need a British national in a prison in Aktau while they're having kind of secret meetings about the nature of the Caspian Sea, which is what he was there for. And I just think they just wanted to get rid of me. It wasn't worth prosecuting me. I think they just wanted to brush me under the rug and get me out.
So you're out, and you get back to, how do you get back to the UK from there? Or to Berlin?
Okay, so there was another month in Baku in Azerbaijan. So things didn't get better after that, I should stress. What happened was I was deported from Aktau, flown straight over the Caspian to Baku in Azerbaijan. And I spent another month there just on the streets. The drinking didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. It accelerated. My memory of that period is murky. It's difficult to see day to day what I was doing. But for a while, I was hanging around the business suites in the Hilton and stuff in the center of Baku, trying to make things happen. And I remember thinking that what I needed to do was buy another bike and keep cycling. That was where my head was at. I was gonna.
Did you have your passport?
Passport was stolen in Baku. I was there for about 2 weeks when I blacked out drunk on the street and my passport was stolen. And I had to go to the British embassy in Baku, who I think were expecting me, in order to get an emergency travel document. And that was a difficult process. The embassy in Baku was begging me to stop drinking. And when the embassy is begging you to stop drinking, you should probably stop, right? Wasn't a good situation. But we organised an emergency travel document. And the first flight that I was booked on, they wouldn't let me on the flight because I was too drunk. And the second flight, which was the next day, so it was a Sunday, the team from the British embassy turned up at the airport in person on their own time to make sure that I got on the plane, which I did. And I'm very, very grateful for that embassy's work.
And where was the flight to?
That was to London. So I went back to London, down to Cornwall, where
your parents are waiting to.
Yeah, my parents put me up I was there for 2 weeks before I thought that I was okay. And then I moved back to Zagreb in Croatia and continued my job. And I was there for another 2 months before they sent me home as well.
So that's an incredible. It's difficult to know what to say to that, because there are so many points during that journey that it could have ended in tragedy. And I don't want to heroize, is that a word? I don't want to romanticize that journey, those experiences, because they are hellish. And the irony is they could have been wonderful in the absence of alcohol. And really fascinating.
Yes, I agree. I agree. I would love, if I have the opportunity, I would like to do it again sober.
I think Ewan McGregor and the biker guys did it, didn't they? They did all that stuff. So that could have been some kind of the inspiration for it. So, okay, so in terms of, I wanted to ask you about how you found your way. So at this point, you're in your mid-30s and you're deep entrenched in real existential fuck life, fuck the world alcoholism, right? So it's not problem drinking, it's daily. How do you pull yourself out?
Well, it took a long time. And it wasn't, I had to be forced in the end. I didn't go willingly into sobriety. I was ready to drink myself to death. That was almost the goal, right? And I knew that I'd had this incredible experience that very few people are ever likely to experience anything like it. So what I did was I lived out the dream of every Irish writer, of every writer of Irish heritage, which is to write a book drunk, which I did. So I rented. When I was sent back from the job in Croatia, they kept me on a retaining contract, which meant I was still earning a healthy salary and not required to do much work. So what I figured I would do was I would spend some time writing a book about my experience. But what I actually did was I was drunk for 8 months. Again, more and more alcohol this time. It was only increasing. And at the end of that period, the book was finished. or so I thought. And I stopped drinking. I stopped for 2 days. Right? I've been that 8 months. I was drinking a liter and a bit, like a bottle and a bit of vodka or whiskey every single day for that 8 month period. And then I stopped. I just thought I just didn't drink one day. That was all. I just didn't do it. I finished the book, and then about 2 days after that, after stopping the drinking, I had extremely serious delirium tremens, which is the most serious manifestation of alcohol withdrawal. And that was a wake up call for everybody. That I think what people don't understand about delirium tremens is that it is a medical emergency. It's not lying in bed and seeing pink elephants, although it can be that. It is also fatal a lot of the time. It's like even with the recent statistics are that even with medical treatment, it can still be fatal about 12 to 15% of the time. That's a higher mortality rate than a heart attack. Untreated, it is fatal about 40 to 50% of the time. It's incredibly dangerous. And my first experience of it was deeply traumatic. And after that, that began the process of sobering up. It still wasn't smooth after that. It's not like I stopped immediately.
Well, that's a brush with death, right? So, and the consequences. I mean, you're faced with the end of your existence. It's an existential crisis. So that's the forcing bit. That's what forced you to address this pathological drinking.
Yeah, yeah,
So what is delirium tremens? Is the body's reaction to something, is it? Is the body's reaction to the lack of alcohol going into the system following a sustained period of ingestion of it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's pretty reasonable. Look, I need to make clear that I'm not a doctor on this stuff. I can only talk from my own experience of it
Yeah.
and the little bit that I've learned about it since. But think of it like when your body has been taking in that amount of alcohol for that long, it becomes accustomed to its presence. And alcohol is a very powerful depressant. It suppresses your central nervous system. So left to its own devices, alcohol will put you to sleep. That's what it's trying to do. It's trying to make you lose consciousness, and your body is resisting that by trying to keep you awake, trying to keep you alert, and it's trying to maintain homeostasis. And when you suddenly withdraw that alcohol, when it's been at an incredibly high level for a long time, and you suddenly withdraw it, your body is still working against it, even though it's no longer there. You enter a state of hyperexcitability, and your neurons are firing wildly out of control. And your entire nervous system goes into emergency mode. And that has very strange physiological effects. So there's standard ones that you can measure, such as like heart rate, incredibly high blood pressure, sweating, all of that stuff. But it also comes with some symptoms that are not. It's not possible to enumerate them. So hallucinations and delusions and paranoia, and not just fear of impending death, but certainty that you are going to die. The process of delirium tremens is traumatic in its own right. Like a lot of people, especially because I work in recovery and sobriety, a lot of people drink to avoid trauma or to suppress trauma. But going through delirium tremens is a process of trauma in itself. The things you will see in delirium tremens are traumatic. And I mean traumatic in a psychological sense. They leave you with trauma. And for months and months after that experience, I would have nightmares or flashbacks to the things that I had seen in delirium tremens. That's how terrible they were. Very, very strange phenomenon.
Very, very, and that was what pushed you then into the recovery phase, right? I mean, I know there have been, watching your content, there have been some relapses, right? So, um, but I think, is it a year since you last touched the bottle?
It's a little bit more. I'm cagey about how much time I've got these days because I don't want to be beholden to it by my audience.
Yeah.
But I've been in the process of getting sober since early 2019. So that's 5.5 years, and most of that has been sober. There's been a couple of relapses a couple of years ago. There was a period of relapses, but mostly sober for that time. And I'm grateful every day for it.
Are you able to identify the triggers that would push you towards a relapse and negate it, or deal with it? Or are you aware of, can you offer any advice on that piece?
You picked it up already, I think. Loneliness. Okay, so I spent a lot of time justifying my own loneliness by saying that I am happy in my own company. And if you're the kind of person to say something like that, you need to be sure it's true, because there is always a risk that you're lying to yourself about it and you're trying to disguise the fact that you truly are lonely. And if you are a man in your late 20s or early 30s and you worry about your loneliness, call it what it is and identify it early, because we're very bad at speaking to each other about this, and it can have absolutely life-wrecking consequences if you don't take a hold of it, if you don't acknowledge it for what it is. So loneliness is one, certainly for me. My own childhood was very happy. I was not a great deal of trauma from that, but I understand that a lot of people do have huge amounts of trauma, and you need to be working on that because that can trip you up unexpectedly later in life. To answer your question directly, I don't know what my own triggers are for relapse. I've never figured it out, and I've spent a lot of time and money with specialists trying to identify exactly what it is that's causing. How could I have 3 years of sobriety and then be doing well and then suddenly just throw it all away? I don't have a clear answer, but my strategy for not throwing it all away is to try to treat all of it. When you get sober, it's so important that you're not just changing your drinking patterns, you're also changing your whole behavior. It's not enough to just stop drinking. You've only treated a small factor of it. And the way that I treat everything is by speaking to sober people all the time, talking about my own sobriety as honestly as I possibly can, and then physical fitness and some philosophical reading and that kind of thing.
What's your perspective on replacement theory? What I'm calling kind of replacement theory. So, what are your thoughts there?
I'm in favor of it. People. So I go to the gym a lot, and people often accuse me, especially in the comments on YouTube, that I'm just replacing alcohol with fitness. And I'm like, yeah, I am. And I don't quite see the argument of that being a negative. Like, if you're replacing an unhealthy thing with a healthy thing, that is a net positive. There are some questions about obsessiveness and that kind of thing, but my goal, okay, let me put it in these terms. If I have another drink, I will die. It will kill me. I don't think I'm going to survive another relapse. The most recent ones was I came this close, and I know it, and I saw it. My body and my mind, my subconscious, and my hallucinations told me that I was about to die, and I believed them. Anything I do that's not that is better than that. And I think we need to take it on a case by case, but replacement therapy is perfectly valid if it's keeping somebody sober.
And then anxiety, right? Have heard the idea posited many times that alcohol is the most widely used treatment for anxiety in the world.
Yeah,
What's your perspective on that?
I agree. I was diagnosed with a generalized anxiety disorder before I got sober, and when I got sober, that went away, and I no longer take anything. we treat alcohol, we treat anxiety with alcohol, but alcohol quickly becomes the cause. Right? There is a physiological and a psychological anxious effect caused by alcohol. It's well attested, and cutting alcohol out of your life as much as possible is just the easiest way to start treating anxiety. If you're treating anxiety with alcohol, there's very rarely a happy ending for that story. It doesn't get easier. It just gets worse and worse and worse.
Stu, before I leave you, tell me about Bat Country on your YouTube channel because I know you started putting up videos a long time ago, but recently there's been a massive surge in interest. Tell us what's going on.
Well, Backcountry, my YouTube channel it's a major part of my own sobriety. I started it to keep a record of some of the terrible things that I'd seen in Delirium Tremens. That was what my first major video was about, that experience and some of the horrendous visualizations that I'd had. But it turns out I wasn't the only one having them, and it's drawn a massive audience, or increasingly massive audience, of people who've been through it too, and who really, really resonate with the kind of difficult stuff that I'm talking about. And it's led to all sorts of crazy opportunities, even like this, talking to you. I mean, this wouldn't have happened without Backcountry. And the response I get to it daily is unbelievable. When you put yourself on YouTube, you must have experienced this as well. Like, you occasionally just get people being mean for the sake of being mean, right? They will just say things. But compared to other people that I speak to, I get very little of that. I get a huge amount of engagement of people saying, oh my God, I see that in myself. I can totally understand that perspective. And it's led to other opportunities too. The future for Backcountry is a diverse and varied one, and I'm very excited about it. But one of the things that's on the horizon is in the UK, I'm working with a business called We Love Lucid. And We Love Lucid for several years has been an adventure travel company for sober people, which is an amazing idea. It just makes so much sense. And that business has been like organizing trips and exciting adventure for people who don't drink. You don't have to be in recovery. You just don't have to be, not a drinker. And on May 17th of next year, 2025, we've organized a massive open to everyone bike ride from a town in Devon called Beer, B-E-R, to a town in Hampshire called Soberton, which kind of suggests itself, right? So it's 120 miles between those two villages, and we're going to do the cycle as a massive group of sober people all in one day, for no particular reason other than to celebrate sobriety, So exciting times.
It is exciting times, and your channel is fascinating. You have a very compelling way of telling stories, and they are incredible and fascinating. And long may your sobriety continue, Stu. So thank you so much. Where can people find you, by the way? Is it Backcountry, Instagram? Where's the best place to find you?
Instagram and YouTube is where I live. So Instagram is Backcountry YT, and then on YouTube, it's easiest if you just search like Backcountry Alcohol or something like that, or Backcountry Sober. You'll find me that way.
Stuart Nugent, thank you so much. It's been a real privilege and a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.